Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Noah Blaylock Show. Today, I'm very excited to have my guest, Sheldon Richman, come on the show. Now, Sheldon, as I was looking online for a lot of times, I'll do an introduction for my guests. I'll pull up like a paragraph from a website that says kind of their accomplishments and stuff. But I found a lot of websites with your information. I didn't know which one would be like up to date. So I thought I'd go ahead and just let you tell everyone who you are, what you do, and yeah.
Okay, well, I am the executive editor of the Libertarian Institute, which is a very active website and book publisher on the whole range of issues, public policy issues and philosophy. And they published my two most recent books, which are Coming to Palestine, which was published in 2019, and then last year's book, What Social Animals Owe to Each Other. And you can reach them on the web at libertarianinstitute.org.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks for that introduction. And today we're going to be talking about your book, Separating School and State: How to Liberate America's Families. I'll go ahead and show that for our guests. And it is a fantastic read. I read it a bit ago, and I remember it being really good. And in preparation for the podcast, I reread it, and I got to say, it was even better than I remember. I thought you did a fantastic job with it. And for people who haven't read the book yet, a lot of it dealt with, I would say, principles and the nature of the system. So even though it was published, 1994, right? Yeah. So even though it was published a little while ago, the things that he writes in the book are still relevant and uphold today. So let's go ahead and jump into it.
Sure. Great. Happy to.
All right. So what I wanted to hit on today, particularly with the book, were the points you made on how the democracy equals bureaucracy portion of the book, how what's wrong with the public schools is that they're doing exactly what they were designed to do, or at the very least, what they cannot help but do. And in conjunction with that, the school's undermining an assault of the family. So want to go ahead and jump into that?
Sure, and you hit on several issues there that are key to the book. The first one you mentioned was the democracy equals bureaucracy, and that's really a pretty simple point. The idea is that agencies of government, even democratic government, different kinds of incentives from agencies that are, let's say, firms or nonprofit organizations that are in the private sector for a very simple reason. The ones in the private sector have to get their revenues through persuasion, whether they're selling their service, they have to persuade buyers, or if they're a nonprofit, they need to raise donations, they need to persuade. And so there's immediate feedback. People don't like what they're doing or don't think they're doing as good a job as as they might do. But a government agency is completely different, and this would apply to local public schools, departments of education at the state level and at the national level. There, they get their revenue through taxation. Local schools get it largely through property tax, but some states, state income taxes and sales taxes may provide the money. And there's not the same sort of feedback, because the taxpayer can't say, I'm unhappy with the service, I'm going to go elsewhere. In other words, there's no incentive system that's based on freedom and competition. The freedom of the consumer or the donor in the case of a nonprofit, because a lot of schools are nonprofits and might remain nonprofits. They're free to go elsewhere if they're unhappy with what it is they're either buying or financing. But a taxpayer can't say, I'm unhappy, I won't pay taxes this year, maybe if you come around and do a better job next year I'll reconsider. They can't do that. So that introduces a whole different and perverse incentive system. And that's really the nature of a bureaucracy. I'm really using here the analysis of Ludwig von Mises, the great economist of the Austrian school, although he spent his last years in the United States. He wrote a little book called Bureaucracy, where he lays out this distinction between a bureaucracy and an enterprise or a private organization that's selling or providing a service. And I think that's devastating to the case for government schools.
Mhm.
Because
Let's
they're never going to be as responsive, they're never going to be getting the information. It's not so much, it's part of it's they don't need to be responsive. I mean, they have to be to some extent responsive because people can get mad at school board meetings and, and you can take your kids out of school and put them in private school, the government schools. However, that means you're paying twice, once through taxes and once through direct tuition. So I'm not saying there's zero feedback and zero incentive to respond, but what they're not really getting is the information that consumers are kind of constantly feeding, and donors would be, to schools in a free marketplace, just by their choices. That's always providing information, a constant flow, uninterrupted, and you don't see that with schools that are ultimately bureaucratically organized. Now, you mentioned a couple of other issues, and I talked so much about the first one, they've slipped away, so you want to remind me, I think we had two others there.
Yeah. So there was how democracy equals bureaucracy, and also the assault and undermining of the family.
Right. And this is very important, and this goes back to the early days of government schooling, the beginnings of government schooling in the United States. But education was regarded as a function of the family, of the parents, and the point there is that if government largely removes the important decisions from the parents and from the family to some extent has lost a major function. Certainly, the decisive decision making, many of the about many of the things that have to be decided during a child's time in school. You've actually, I'm not saying it was intended, but in some cases it might have been intended, it has the effect of removing an important function, and therefore, to some extent, the family withers because it's lost the function. Families are defined by functions, and if big important functions are removed, it can't help but withers to some extent. Now, some people in the early days thought the family and the parents were bad influences, and they wanted to bring them into the schools to make good citizens of them out of them. They thought the parents were, practiced too many vices, father drank, this and that, all kinds of concerns, the pioneers of what was called the common school in those days. And part of the goal was to get the kids away from their parents for at least a substantial part of the day. Nobody's going to talk like that today very much because it would be bad politics and the person would get in trouble. But that's really what was going on in the schools. The pioneers of the early schools promised that they would be able to fix the social problems that had their origin in the problems at home. Children had at home by parents who were not intelligent enough to bring up their kids. It's funny because now, years later, the schools will say, teachers' unions will say, you can't expect us to solve kids bring social problems with them to school every day. There's no way you can expect us to fix all that. Well, they promised they would in the early days. I mean, I don't expect them to fix it, but they said in the early days, the real pioneers in the 19th century of government schooling that wanted more and more government schooling, promised that that's exactly what they were going to do. Be able to solve those problems that originated in the home because the homes weren't very great environments for kids. So, yeah, all those things are fallacies, these advantages of government schooling.
Mm-hmm. And that was a great summary of those two portions. And, a lot of times we can give these talking points, but I want to dig into these a little bit deeper and let people, have a little bit more to reflect on. Let's go back to that dependence on taxation, where the schools, it's part of their nature. They're inherently linked to whatever the consequence of taxation is. You talked about how it creates this distinct attitude amongst those who run the schools or work for them. You talked about it with in both terms of the school board selection and voters perceiving their vote as being insignificant. So dig into that a little for us.
Well, the way you change things in the public school system is that Yeah, you get to vote, you may get to vote for school board, I guess in most places those are elective offices, maybe not everywhere. But you get, so you get to, vote for the mayor or whoever's gonna appoint them. But that's not a very effective way to give feedback and have influence over a process. I mean, if you think about because, if you're gonna vote, you have to get 50% plus one more vote than 50% in order to carry the day. So it's not just a matter of you going out and casting your one vote, which is typically insignificant. If you live in a very tiny town, it may mean, something, but any sizable jurisdiction, you're one of, it could be millions of people voting. And so what kind of power is that? We always hear, oh, your vote matters, every vote counts, make your voice heard. We hear this at every election time, not just school boards. But people want to stop and think about that for a second. How much difference does their one vote make? Unless you live in a very tiny town, you will not be able to think of an election that was won or lost by one vote or a tie. I mean, once in a while in the news, like I say, you'll read about some tiny place where the mayor, they flipped a coin to decide who of the tied candidates, which one will become the mayor. But the chance of that shrinks astronomically the moment you get to anything much larger than the smallest of jurisdictions. So it's not real feedback. On the other hand, a consumer in a marketplace, a school consumer of buying education services for your child, you can decide you're not happy with the school, any time of the year. You don't have to wait for the end of the term to change schools, and you're free to change schools. Now you need the money, but the reason it's expensive because the market is constricted because the government gives away what appears to be a free service. It's not really free because you pay through taxes, but it appears free because you're not paying at the schoolhouse door. You're not paying, to have your child go in. It's the connection is so broken between the payment and the receiving the service that you don't get that same kind of again, incentive system that a marketplace permits. So that's a huge difference in how schools get governed. And so you end up with bureaucracies like teachers union basically running the show, and parents don't matter much. The parents don't even get to pick the school in most cases. It depends on where you live and how the district draws the lines. And since it's so neighborhood oriented, and it may be a little less so than it was in earlier days. There may be some change, but I think it's essentially the same. People who can live in expensive neighborhoods, tend to see better schools, but people who live in not so expensive neighborhoods can't just pull their kid out of the school that they're assigned to, the kid's assigned to, and send them to a school in a better neighborhood because there's not free choice among schools. It's all engineered for lots of different reasons, academic, diversity, racial, ethnic diversity. They do all kinds of things, which removes choice from parents over what schools they can go to. And choice is restricted. Now, there's more choice than there used to be. There's charter schools and vouchers in a few places, but it's still limited, and you got to fight to even get that change made in your own area. So, mainly the bureaucracy protects itself, and the teachers union protects itself from against any threats to their survival.
Mm-hmm. Also, something that you did that was really great in the book was that you talked about the bureaucracy and the problems that it causes, and then you give direct comparisons to how that doesn't translate in the marketplace. For example, you talked about what if a citizen only agrees with some of the positions taken by a school board candidate, and how that doesn't necessarily translate into the marketplace. You don't get to, or delve into that a little.
Yeah, this is a general problem with electing people anyway to office because there's a couple of places where slips can occur. First of all, like you say, you may agree with some of what a candidate says, and maybe you decide that you agree a little bit more with A versus B. But in each case, there's still positions A and B take that you don't like at all. Now you got to kind of try to do this weighing to see, you know, which one do you dislike the most. I mean, imagine going into a grocery store, and instead of just going through the aisles picking out what you want and what you like, there are just like 2 or 3 sealed shopping carts with a variety of products already in those carts, and you get to vote on which one everyone is going to get that week. You like some of the things in each of the carts, you dislike some of the things in each of the carts. Now you got to look at each one and say, okay, which has the most that I like and the least that I don't like, and then you pick one. But that's not enough. That doesn't mean you get it. You got to go home and wait for the votes to come in to find out whether you go back the next day to get A, B, or C. That's what we do when we, quote, buy policies by electing candidates. Markets don't work that way. You go to a store, first of all, you only have to buy what you want. If they carry things you don't like, it doesn't matter. You don't buy those things. And there's going to be competition. And so you can, if you don't like one store, you find another store. These days, you go online and buy it online and get it delivered the same day or 2 days later. You have real choices. I mean, government systems, including democracy, is about limiting people's choices, not expanding people's choices, and therefore the services are usually grossly inferior.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of ironic too, because most people who work in the school system will talk about, we're here to broaden your horizons and expand your possibilities, and it's like, well, if you want me to be having all this freedom, then maybe I could leave. No. So it's just irony incarnate. You also talked a lot about how, with people not knowing what they pay in school taxes, and how again, caught up in bureaucracy, that knowledge is how that dilutes their willingness to act in the meaningness of when they do act.
Right. I mean, I don't know that most people think of their property tax as the payment for school. First of all, a whole lot of people pay it. Everybody has to pay it if you own property, or if it's a sales tax, if you're buying stuff, whether you have kids or not. And just as much will go to the school system, whether you have kids or not. So in other words, you're taxing everybody on a kind of a public goods theory that everybody benefits from schooling, so everybody ought to pay for it, even people without kids or whose kids are now grown or who never had kids and don't intend to have kids. And so, again, it's this disconnect between payment, which is through the tax system and seems remote from schooling, and the actual service that you think of as education when you send your kids to school. So it's not the same. It's one of the reasons the incentive system is so different, because you've broken this link between payment and the thing you're picking out to buy. In this case, educational services. And so it just leads to this idea that governments are not going to be very responsive in providing education services. I should mention also a very good book by Brian Kaplan, the economist at George Mason University, called
The Case
Against Education, where he points out, schools have an interest in making it seem that their services are really, really essential, and there shouldn't be any big changes that would mean maybe fewer teachers or a shorter number of years. You mentioned if you want to quit, they'll tell you no below a certain age. But Brian asked the question, and he's got lots of data in the book to back it up, that most people, nobody needs to spend 12 years in elementary through high school, and before they can go to college, if that's what they want to do, to study, something that requires higher education, like medicine or law or stuff like that. And most of the stuff you will encounter in school has nothing to do with what you're going to do in life, no matter what your job is. And it's stuff you can pursue on your own if and when you become interested in it. Most kids, can't stand the idea of reading Shakespeare in high school or lower, and yet they're all forced to sit through it and be bored and fall asleep and hate their teachers and hate themselves. And he makes a very convincing case that you wouldn't need to spend that much time. It'd be much better to spend the balance of the time in some sort of apprenticeship where you're learning something that will make a living for yourself and a respectable life. And then for somebody like I said who's going to go into science or higher math or law or medicine, something like that, that person would obviously be getting more schooling than someone who, given the choice, would say, I really don't need all this. I mean, I can read Shakespeare later when I'm older and more mature, and I, realize there's something to be learned there. Yeah, I'll go and pursue it myself. But most people don't ever do that.
Hmm. Also, mhm. You also talked about how, again, with the marketplace and entrepreneurs there, they're affected by the threat of financial loss, and how school boards and other bureaucratic officials, they're insulated from that financial accountability, and that kind of gives way to establishing the iron law of oligarchy. Explain that a little bit.
Well, it gets back to the incentives. The idea of the iron law of oligarchy is really sort of an argument against this romance of democracy, that we all get together and we all have our input and we cast our vote, and somehow what arises out of that decision making is really the will of the people. That's the the romance, the romanticization of democracy. But that's not what happens. Most people are busy with their everyday lives. They don't have the time to be studying up on important issues or looking at school board budgets, and that's a lot. Number one, that's not always readily clear to people how to do that. You have to learn how to read budgets and stuff like that. But also think of the time involved in doing that. And a lot of people don't want to spend their time doing that, or attending school board meetings and doing all that stuff, which means a relative few people will be super interested in that. And of course the teachers through the union, and the administrators, the principals and all that stuff, and the politicians, they'll be interested in it. But the bulk of people will be too busy with other things, and you can't really blame them for that. And so a smaller group will emerge, and they'll be the decision makers. But it'll be done in sort of the name of the people, and it'll be said to be through the democratic process, which gives it this facade of that we of our having made the decision, when in fact we didn't make the decision. A relative few people made the decision. But it's a big it's a show. It's almost like a magic trick, right? It's misdirection. Look, we're voting. This is really important, when all the action's really over here, but they're getting you to look over there.
Hmm.
So that's what that iron law is all about.
I like how you said facade, because facades are pretty thin. They fall over, and it only takes a few seconds to see that there's much, or that there's really nothing behind the facade. Like you were talking about how the few who will come out and kind of decide everything. A lot of times when I've been talking with people, a lot of people who advocate for, again, having government involved, they say it should be a democratic process. Everyone should get to have a say. And I have a couple points to make on that. When they say it, I say, well, okay, everyone should have a say. When's the last time, you said something in effect in terms of, trying to affect the policy? It's like, well, I haven't. And it's like, well, there you go. Nobody's, basically nobody is going out there and influencing the education, despite all this, say that they have. And the other thing too is, it's like, well, do people not get a say outside of democracy? For example, in like the marketplace, are you telling me that if we don't make, grocery stores democratic, that you don't get a say in what your family eats that night? Again, with that analogy, it gives the direct translation that by taking it out of the hands of democracy and putting it into capitalism, that you have infinitely more.
Sure.
And
The late Walter Williams had a good way of putting it. He said, here's the deal I have with my supermarket. They don't know when I'm going to show up. They don't know what I'm going to want. And they don't know how much I'm going to want of it. But if they don't have it, they're fired.
mm-hmm.
Now, as consumers, that's the relationship we have with people who sell us things. But we're also on the other side of that, right? As producers, we have to be responsive to ultimately to the people that are buying our services or our products. And, but that's a pretty good deal for consumers if the government's not in the way blocking competition, which it does with education. Like I said, there's more choice than there used to be, but there's not a free market in education. Because even like things like charter schools, you know, are regulated by government. Charters can be yanked if the bureaucrats don't like the school, even if the parents are happy with the school. The charter can be revoked. It can be a political decision. That's not a market. That's not a market institution. I mean, it's an attempt at, you know, introducing some choice because there's been, you know, some demand for it. So there's been maybe some more pragmatic politicians think, well, we better have introduce some choice because people are getting, you know, they're dissatisfied, and the ones that can afford to leave the public schools are leaving them to go to private school or even or homeschool. And so there's been some, you know, maybe more than token moves in that direction, but it's not what it ought to be, which is really free competition.
Mm-hmm.
You know, defund the public schools. My view is turn the schools over to the teachers, the individual school over to the teachers and the principals in that school. Don't give them any more tax money. See if they can make a go of it. Meanwhile, free everybody, the parents whose kids were going to that school, to choose where they want to go. Maybe they want to stay in that school. Fine. If it seems to be doing well, stay. And let's see them make a go of it. If they can, you know, charge tuition or also raise money from donors if that's the way they want to do it.
There's a good quote that kind of summarizes his. It's from Jake the dog from an animated series called Adventure Time. He says, "Bad biscuits make the baker broke, bro." And so we've got a lot of bad biscuits, and then no one's interested in firing the baker. And it's like, well, let's let everyone bake and see who does the best. Also, what I wanted to talk about again was how the school system is an open assault and undermining the family unit. Again, you don't have to necessarily be religious or spiritual to take issue with that because there's a lot of socioeconomic implications of that. And it's ironic because the family's condition, again, studies have shown, is directly connected with the quality, or rather the educational outcome of children, how well they're doing in school and such, and they're undermining that simultaneously. I know you talked about how the parents not getting to select the child's school weakens the family. Parents don't choose the values in their children's school. So go into that a little bit.
Well, they don't, you know, they don't have much say over the curriculum because the experts think the parents don't know anything. So why should they have much input on things like curriculum? So if the kids are being taught to read by the basically the memorization method, you know, the look-say method rather than phonics, parents, you know, may be out of luck if they can't afford to get take the kids out of the school, or if they can't get into a charter school because there's so few of them, or you know, that they can't get a spot. They're then stuck with a bad approach to reading, which can be damaging to a kid for life if he's not if he doesn't learn to read early on. Properly, yeah, he can be handicapped really for the rest of his life. So, you know, you have very little say. You can go and complain at a school board meeting, or you know, or with the teacher visitation, but you know, lots of luck. That doesn't mean you're going to have any impact on the curriculum, and you're not, because you're regarded as unqualified. But you know, parents have been teaching their kids to read for a long time. You know, centuries before the experts came along and said, no, don't teach your kids to read. We'll take care of it, and you know, they get to school, and that was a big mistake, and it's, you know, just across the board, arithmetic, and they, you know, years ago they introduced something called the new math, which is I think almost designed to lock the parents out, so they couldn't even help the parents with the kids' schoolwork, homework, because it was a new approach to doing things like just, you know, basic addition and subtraction and multiplication, and you can see there's going to be an incentive for the school establishment to do things like that, because they have to constantly justify themselves why parents have less, hands-on control. Now, look, a lot of parents may be fine with that. They're busy, they're trying to make a living, and the government is constantly creating problems even for making a living, whether it's inflation or a recession every once in a while or something that makes it hard to make ends meet, and you need two incomes. So a lot of parents taking the path of least resistance may say, okay, look, if they claim they're the experts, they want to handle this, they know what they're doing, fine, I won't worry about that so much. But that's a loss, that the fact that they've been seduced into this idea that I don't need to worry about that anymore. My kids are in good hands. I don't think that's a good thing. And I've always been glad that there was a homeschool movement, which has strengthened over the years. I guess it's gained some during this pandemic with the lockdowns and the closing of schools. But we'll see what happens when it's all over with, whether homeschooling gets a new rush in popularity.
Mm-hmm. And again, we've been talking a lot about the irony of a lot of what the school says and then what it does. For example, the analogy I like to use is someone coming along, breaking people's legs with a baseball bat and saying, there's a need for wheelchairs, so therefore you have to depend on me for those wheelchairs. If someone suggests, well, let's get rid of him, someone says, well, then where would we get wheelchairs? Then the response is, well, we wouldn't need them. So the school system is breeding apathy in parents, because when there is, again, nothing, for the most part, for most of them, there's nothing they can do about changing what's happening or changing their child's school. It's hard for them to get involved or to make a difference. It's no wonder that they're apathetic. And then again, that directly affects the child's learning and education path. And then they turn around and say, look, the family's not involved. We got to step up and take over. And it's like, well, wait a second. You're the one breeding apathy in parents on a massive scale, hundreds of millions of parents. And that, over time, it's so much, it's ridiculous that they can stare in the face of all that and say, and just say the opposite.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. They say we want engaged parents, but then really everything they do is to create disengaged.
Mm-hmm. And it's important to point out that it's regardless of intent. That's kind of a big part of the premise of your book, is that the schools are doing what they can't help but do. So you can say, I have a great school board member, or I have great teachers, but regardless of what any individual says, or even does try to do, it can't help but, break down the family.
Yeah, John Taylor Gatto, who was the late John Taylor Gatto, great writer, former school teacher, who basically renounced school and became a homeschool advocate and a sort of a very good radical critic of how the government does schooling. He used to say, if you put a bad person you put a good person in a bad system, the system wins. Mm-hmm. So there are dedicated teachers, there are dedicated, I'm sure, even administrators, principals, but they're up against the bureaucracy. So they're going to eventually get co-opted, or they're just going to lose and get fed up and quit, or just keep quiet and just go with it, because what else are they going to do?
Yeah. Another thing is the values that are taught in school are, again, not really, the parents really have next to no say in what those values are. And I know you talked about how sometimes people will say, well, let's have a values-free education. Well, that's really a chimera, because the absence of values in of itself sends a message that they're not important. Some of those values you talked about, it's funny enough, because they talk about, we want to put these values in, but then again, the values that they're teaching are once again undermining the family unit, and therefore education's quality and effectiveness with the child. You talked about how the welfarism, the new puritanism and suspicion of parents, the crazy sex ed, and how all those things, again, undermine the family. Touch up on that for us, would you?
Well, I come at it sort of from a general position. I'm not approaching it from a religious perspective at all, because that's not my own perspective. But I respect people who, want to educate their children in the religious tradition they believe in. I mean, we can't have the government countermanding that. And if you have what is supposed to be a value-neutral school, because they can't teach religion, but they have to then basically not appear to be teaching any kind of values at all, These days, I guess they make an exception for, say, diversity, without ever really quite defining what that means. But parents have lost control because they can't send their kids to a school, to one that reflects their values through the curriculum, which they may well want to do. I mean, it's true, as you point out, there can't be value-free education. I mean, are kids permitted to, cheat on tests? Well, if it's value-free, then why shouldn't they be permitted to cheat on their tests? What's wrong with doing that? So you can't really so you end up with some sort of really sort of plain vanilla kind of value orientation. The schools began, again, in the 19th century, as Protestant schools, explicitly Protestant schools. And Horace Mann and the other pioneers of the system, they wanted it to be kind of non-sectarian Protestantism because they didn't want to upset families and parents who were of particular denominations, where the differences were greater than other denominations. So they wanted a pretty sort of bland Protestant education, which was hard on the Catholics. Catholics ended up setting up their own school system because they were unhappy that they couldn't even use their Bible versus the Protestant Bible. And, you had Jewish schools starting up too. Then, of course, there's a change. The society became more secular. In the 60s, we get a Supreme Court decision saying you can't teach religion in school or have Bible readings. I remember Bible readings in public school in the 60s, late 50s, 60s. I think 62 might have been that decision. And so things swung the other way. And so when religion was dominant, then the religious parents probably weren't so upset by value-laden education like that. But when they swung toward so-called secular humanism, that's a perfectly fine term, secular humanism, then Protestant parents and other religious parents were unhappy. But they just got hoisted by their own petard. I mean, they didn't predict that the society might change from religious to more secular, and then that would end up changing the schools. But that's what happened. Instead of promoting private education and home education, where if you want to teach religion, you can teach religion, they wanted everybody, Jew and Catholic alike, to have to sit through Protestant-oriented, Bible readings and other sort of things. And so they miscalculated there. They should have been working on privatization of schooling, not making sure prayer stays in the school. You still hear people today say, "We got to get prayer back in the schools." And by that they mean public schools.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And again, it's ironic. We live in a society that's constantly talking about, we got to stand up for the minority. The minority's being trampled on. Well, that's exactly what the school system's doing, because regardless of which kind of value set is in the minority, again, whether that's religious, whether that's particularly Christian, or whether that's, atheistic, or whether it's, Satanism, or just any set of values, as long as it's in the minority, by putting the schools in charge, we're saying that if you have a belief in the minority, your opinion doesn't matter. And we get to, again, it's that arrogance that we get to know what's better for your child, and we'll take it from here. And also another point that I thought was really good, where you talked about parents versus non-parents, people with kids in school versus not. If we're talking about democracy, everyone gets a say, then at the end of the day, you're saying that parents get as much say as someone who doesn't even have kids, or someone else who just is not the parent of their own kids. So again, even if the system is working perfectly where everyone has a say, the parent isn't meant to have the full authority over the child. They're just not.
No, that's right. I mean, the non-parents have the same votes, and they're also paying taxes. But they vote in school board elections and pick other officials who may be influential over education policy. And so parents don't have any special status versus non-parents, because, and the theory there is, like as I mentioned earlier, is sort of a public goods theory, that everybody benefits from kids being educated. They would be worse. Everybody would be worse off if kids were not getting educated. Therefore, everybody should have to pay kids' education, even if they don't have kids. Otherwise, there'd be free riders, right? You wouldn't, a non-parent who's going to benefit from a better society of educated children still has no incentive to put money into the system because he'll figure other people will, the parents will be paying, or even some other non-parents will pay, but therefore I can sit back and enjoy the benefits and not pay anything. That's the theory of public goods, right? We got to crack down on the free riders. And how do you do that? By taxing. Goes back to the compulsion I talked about. You don't get a choice, so you have to participate. And since you're going to benefit, we're going to make you pay for it. Well, why can't a person decide if he's going to benefit, if he thinks he'll benefit, how much he's going to benefit? But also that proves way too much, as many people have pointed out over the years, because there are plenty of things we benefit. We benefit from many people's private choices about what they do, what they buy, and we're not expected to pay for it. I mean, if your next door neighbor puts up lots of nice flowers and plants some trees on his property in order to increase the value of his own land and property, he may well be increasing the value of your land too, because now the neighborhood's a little nicer. So everybody in the neighborhood is benefiting from his spending on those things. Is he justified in having the government tax me, the next door neighbor, because I'm going to be getting benefits, but I haven't put a dime into that person's efforts to improve his own property? Or can he come over himself and say, hey, pay me some money? Well, he can ask if he wants, but I can also freely turn him down. So this idea that you ought to be forced to pay for things that we think you're going to benefit, it's an argument that falls apart as soon as you begin asking questions about it.
Mm-hmm. And I think you put it a really good way. They're not public schools; they're coercive schools.
Yeah, I think that's important. Private schools are public schools too. Who's in there? Members of the public, underage members of the public, but they're still members of the public. So this is another part of the facade, right? You call it public. If you call them government schools or coerced schools, it doesn't sound quite as nice. So you say public schools. Wow, that sounds, who could be against public schools?
Mm-hmm. Let's see. I think we said, 45 minutes, right? All right. So I think it's good in summary to say that the nature of schools lends itself to bureaucracy, which inherently interferes with both quality and the place and role of the family, which ultimately turns education into a big mess. Any final thoughts that you want to add on?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. I think the key word here, which I guess I used it a few times, but I want to stress it, is competition. Competition is very important in all areas of life, but schools no exception. Competition means ideas and possible innovations can be forthcoming from you don't know where. You can't predict where the next great idea, say, in education is going to come from. So you don't want to shut anybody out. In a marketplace, people are free to try things. A lot of them may fail, but a lot of them will succeed at things that no one else thought of. And it could be someone, the last person you would have expected to come up with a great idea. That's what competition does. John Stuart Mill talks about this in his On Liberty when he discusses the marketplace of ideas. You want even things you agree with, you want those ideas constantly criticized, and because there may be something you've overlooked. No one person will consider everything. It's just there's too much to consider, and the future is uncertain. You don't know what's going to be discovered. So what we need is competition, and competition is not the opposite of cooperation, which a lot of people think. Cooperation and competition are the same thing. Competition is you get to choose with whom you wish to cooperate. You freely get to choose, because I may have three choices in front of me. What school do I want to cooperate with, A, B, or C, in a marketplace? So they're competing, but they're competing to get me to cooperate with them. So they're two sides of the same coin. And I think that makes the case for privatization of education clear.
Awesome. Well, I've enjoyed having this interview with you. Just recall, after we hang up, to wait until it finishes uploading. I think there will be like a little progress bar that shows you
Okay.
before closing out of the window.
Yes,
All right.
certainly.
Well, I really
All right,
appreciated
thank
having
you
you on.
for, thanks,
All right.
Noah. Bye-bye.